Hello, world. Happy Webinar Wednesday. It is a pleasure to be joining you along with Dr. José Morey. Dr. Morey is a radiologist by training, but he is much more than a clinician. He is pretty much everywhere. He is actually known to be the first intergalactic doctor. Let's hear more from him. Welcome, Dr. Morey. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate it. Please call me Jose. But yes, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and it's a pleasure to have this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So let's get started and hear some of your background. I just introduced you as the first intergalactic doctor.
Yeah.
In your childhood, did you know you were ever going to be with that title?
No.
What was your thought growing up?
No, and it was funny when it comes up, and I'm used to people asking because people love to hear about it. And that's how I started using it as something with my new company and in the children's books that I started producing kind of a play on it. So originally I'm from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico on the island, and lived there till I was about 6 years old, then left the island, moved to Florida, grew up in Florida the rest of my life. Did my undergrad and then medical school in the Tampa Bay area. I went to University of South Florida for medical school. And then I did all my postdoc up in the Northeast. So I went to Hopkins for internship, and then I finished my radiology residency at Staten Island Hospital, which is part of the North Shore system, if people are familiar with New York. And then ultimately did a fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's really where I started getting into more technology innovation, and my career path started taking a trajectory away from just clinical medicine. So I started studying a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship, and particularly computer science and artificial intelligence. That opened up the opportunity to start working for IBM Watson after I left my training at the University of Pennsylvania. I started working as a consultant in their research lab out of Almaden, California. And then eventually, once IBM Watson Health was developed as a vertical within IBM, which came out a lot of the research that we did in my lab, as well as other labs that were focused on healthcare AI research, I moved over to the business side and started as the Associate Chief Health Officer for all of IBM Watson Health. And then after I finished at IBM, I started continued to work on different projects with different institutions. I started working with the Hyperloop project, which is an Elon Musk kind of brainchild about a high-speed train in a vacuum, as leading their innovation team there. Then I started working with NASA as part of a couple of different programs. One of them is iTech, which is essentially an emerging technology accelerator focused on developing public and private partnerships to be able to solve the deep space problem. How do we go to deep space and not just visit, but how do we colonize? How do we stay there? How do we live? How do we play? How do we work? And developing the technology gaps that we have, which most of them revolve around really the limitations of biology. But I've worked on several other projects through other organizations. I've worked with JPL around extreme bacteria and extreme organisms, evaluating them to use for benefit here on Earth, but also evaluating to see what kind of life could have evolved in extreme environments such as Mars, Venus, Enceladus, Titan, these places that we believe could have life, and then beyond also. Different types of life that could potentially evolve. And the other things that we would do in those projects, and the reason we would study extreme life, is not just for those components, but it's also to identify any kind of life we might identify in other planets. So if you have any fans of Star Trek, there's something called the Prime Directive in Star Trek. With the show, it talks about not involving yourself in the evolution of a society. Well, NASA actually has something like that, but we think of it as contamination, biologic contamination. So we try not to do forward contamination, which is essentially us taking, our own microbiome or terrestrial flora and fauna up into other places, which is hard to do because humans, we carry a lot of bacteria with us, and they just propagate in the space shuttle or in the different rockets that we might use to get to these places. So we try to worry about forward contamination, which we know we've done a really bad job previously. But then the other thing that we also tend to worry about is reverse contamination, and this is going to be important more so now with future missions, because we're going to be start retrieving Martian soil and eventually going to other planets and other moons and bringing things back. So we want to make sure that we can identify any organisms that might be living there so we don't infest ourselves with some sort of intergalactic, organism that we're not prepared for. So those are the kinds of things that we work on and I've worked on in the past. And I've also advised the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy around emerging technology, primarily AI around COVID-19. That was called Cord-19, which a documentary was made on that. I've also advised the United Nations around emerging technology, and I'm an Eisenhower Fellow. Eisenhower Foundation focuses on leaders trying to use different industries for the greater good of humanity and for building bonds of peace across nations. But it's that combination of the emerging technology and the healthcare perspective, or the MD perspective, as to why someone wrote an article about me one time and said I was the first intergalactic doctor, which is what a lot of people tend to like to talk about. When that article came out, actually, I didn't know about it. A friend of mine texted to me, and he was like, "Jose, well, congratulations! I didn't know you were, practicing medicine on Mars now." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And so he forwarded me the article, and I was like, "Oh, that's kind of funny," but I didn't think anything of it. But then I was doing an interview for Univision, which is a Spanish network television, on a certain topic, and then that was one of the first questions that came up. So it said, "Why are you the first intergalactic doctor?" And I was kind of taken back because it was a small article. It wasn't like in a major paper or anything like that. And I was just shocked that someone found that. But now people have picked up on it, and it gets repeated a lot. So, yeah.
It's an awesome title, I have to say.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, well done and well earned, it sounds like. And not only are you working with outer space and science, thinking about the future of humanity outside of this planet, but you're also taking a huge interest in the next generation of human beings on this planet. And I really would love to hear about your efforts with Astra, and particularly some children books. Books for children, and what are those topics that are covered, and what can the viewers know, and what should they know about these books?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for asking. So yeah, even though my career has worked with really smart people, really smart institutions on some really amazing projects, unfortunately within STEM, especially here in the United States, there's a lack of diversity of representation within the field. And it's not just ethnic diversity. Like I often was perhaps the only minority that was on a project, or definitely the only Hispanic or Puerto Rican, but the diversity stems into gender identity, neurodiversity, people with disabilities. It's a well-known issue, a well-known problem. And the thing is that STEM they're the higher paying jobs right now. They're the jobs that help generate generational wealth, not just now, but into the future. And there's a lot of data behind how the countries and the cultures or the groups that aren't involved in the economies of the future, the disparities that we have now through systemic inequalities will only be perpetuated and grow even worse over time. So Ad Astra Media was created through the Eisenhower Fellowship, and it was really focusing on trying to bring diversity to STEM or STEAM, the combination of the arts with those groups of sciences. And the way we're doing it is through media. We thought about, all right, what's the most powerful medium we have to really change hearts and minds? Well, what do we spend most time on? Media, whether it's for fun or for work, for education. There's some form or multiple forms of media that we are always tied to, whether we're constantly on YouTube or TikTok or Twitter or some other social media platform, or we're using some sort of educational platform. Everything revolves around it. And we all stream, we're all tied into how many different streaming services. So we're combining media with representation. So we create STEM media. So it's all scientific based media. So, it might be about engineering, or it might be about mathematics, but we have a diverse protagonist or group of protagonists that are represented in those particular jobs. So even if we're creating, a premise for, let's say, a sitcom, if we're trying to shoot for, the 20 to 40 age demographic, then it'll be science-based, and then the people will have representation within that science-based show. We started with kids content. So we have an early childhood based series. It's digital and it's print. and it's a diversity in STEM series. So we take a different field, whether the first 3 books we have is an astronaut, a physician, so a doctor, and an astronomer. And we created in English, we created Spanish, and we're about to release a bilingual book. So we'll have both the English and the Spanish, so kids can not just learn about science, but also see the diversity in the subject matter or the protagonist, but then also have the multilingual aspect, so they can have all sorts of things that they can be learning that people can use it for. And then we also have an online comic called Intergalactic Academy, that a new page is released every week. So people can follow us on Webtoons or on Instagram at Dr. Intergalactic, and they can see when that drops every week. And that comic, it follows Dr. Intergalactic in space. He has an intergalactic academy, and he's recruited 5 diverse kids from all over the world. And each one of them represents a power of STEAM: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And they each learn about it. They go on adventures. Education is imbued into it. And then they go use those powers to fight ignorance and to solve real world problems from where they come from. We have a little girl from Lebanon, a little girl from Japan, a little girl from Mexico, and a little boy from Oregon, and a little boy from the UK. So they all represent those things. And then we have more things that are coming out all the time. We have a new book. 3 new books are going to be coming out every 2 months. We're going to be covering engineering, aviation, computer science, environmental science. We're going to be covering veterinarian science, and it's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. We have so those books are for 3 to 5. We have the comics that are for 6 to 11. We have another book that's going to be coming out towards the end of this year. Don't have an exact release date, but it's going to range probably between 8 to like 13, and it's focused purely on environmental science. It's going to have a diverse team. You can think of it kind of like a modern day Power Rangers, where each character, which also, as always, has a diverse background, will have strengths that protect a certain environment, whether it's tundra, whether it's desert, whether it's ocean, whether it's in mountainous regions, and how they use those powers and what they could do to interact. And they use that to kind of fight the main antagonist in the movie, which is obvious, or in the book, which is obviously trying to destroy environments through industries and other aspects.
It totally reminds me. So my generation was before Power Rangers, but Captain Planet. I don't know if you remember that, but I was obsessed.
Yeah, very Captain Planet, very Captain Planet.
Very Captain Planet.
And it's funny, when the author wrote it, I was like, oh, this is kind of like Captain Planet. But yeah, I thought Power Rangers was something that people would be more inclined to remember. But yes, Captain Planet is definitely a perfect one to think of what it is, a more modern day Captain Planet, and more based in real science as well. So that's the other aspect, because ultimately what we're doing, and we have this also available for some of our early content. So if anyone's interested, we have educational modules that go along with our entertainment books. So that we've worked with educators to create, so that schools can actually teach these modules within the classrooms. That we sell them per class. And there right now we only have 1 week modules. Eventually we want to expand to whole semester modules, but so that teachers can both have diversity and STEM at the same time. And then they can have the books that the kids could, read at home for fun, fall in love with the characters, and then they could learn alongside those very same characters that look like them, that speak like them, that come from their same backgrounds, so they can envision themselves growing up and being a doctor, being an environmental scientist, being a microbiologist, being an epidemiologist. Those are the things that we're trying to inspire kids to do.
That is so important. So important to have that, to be able to identify yourself in that type of position in the future. Definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well done with all of that. It sounds like it's a lot of team effort, but you definitely are leading the way. So well done. And it sounds like, well, just like what you were saying about Captain Planet, Power Rangers, what you're really talking about is the One Health approach. Teamwork between people of different backgrounds, strengths, disciplines. We come together and we prevent and solve complicated problems. And yeah, I think clearly I'm a huge fan of that. So I think that's wonderful. So coming from the medical perspective, the human medical perspective, do you feel like, is there enough conversation in and about One Health? Or, I mean, when you were going through medical school, did you ever hear the term before, or what? Could you just explain that a little bit?
No, I don't think I ever heard the term One Health before in medical school. It's not something that in medical school or in traditional medical training were often taught, at least when I was going through medical school. Now those things are evolving. Now people are starting to, it's like the inclusion of arts into STEM. People are understanding the importance of the humanities, the importance of the entirety of the patient, a holistic perspective. Usually old school medicine was very much, orthopedics as a joke, or we kind of make fun of orthopedics where it's like break bone, fix bone. They just kind of solve the problem that's in front of them. But it doesn't take into account the entire patient's perspective. And I think that's one of the things that my heavy STEM background is obviously medicine, but then artificial intelligence. And honestly, when people started talking about AI, people started thinking about, oh, AI is going to eliminate doctors, or AI is going to solve the world's problems in healthcare and in everything. But it hasn't. And one of the reasons it hasn't is because disease is complex. And when you're talking about from a physician's perspective, most of the time, the only data we have is point of care data. It's when patients come in to see us in the clinic, or whether, if they have a really bad event and they have to be in the hospital for a couple of weeks, we have data then. But beyond that, that's just point of care medicine. We don't have, and at some point that patient wasn't diseased, right? Unless you're born with a developmental or a genetic anomaly, everyone's born normative when it comes to health and wellness. Everyone starts healthy, and disease starts progressing over time and developing over time. But we haven't really done a really good job. It's been very difficult to identify how we transition from being a healthy well to being, pathology and disease. And that's something that AI, I think, has shown us, or at least brought to light, that we don't have enough data yet to really solve some of the problems that we want to solve, because we're not asking the right questions, and because we're not looking at the patient from what I call a panomic perspective. And we're starting to grow. We're starting to understand that. That's where, we're including proteomics, microbiomics, genomics, phenomics. We're including all those, but really understanding that it's not just biomarkers, it's understanding environmental factors of disease, and understanding socioeconomic factors of disease, and understanding what it is that actually creates health and wellness, as opposed to just, once the cancer arrives, treating the cancer with a chemotherapy or some other kind of therapeutic. It's really about understanding, how does that cancer cell even develop? Is it the fact that it was a person's genomics, with the fact that they lived at a certain altitude or a certain latitude? Is it the fact that it was, what they ate on a daily basis, on top of perhaps the particles per million within the air quality that they have, that kind of, gave them the right amount of insults to the right cells to cause that disease to happen? Or more than likely, is it on a spectrum? Like, is a certain genomics with a certain environment give you a certain probability to develop a disease over an X number of years? And once we solve that, how do we adjust that? Can we just say, hey, if you move from this environment to environment B, then your probability has dropped from 57% to 22%. So those kind of things are very important. And then obviously the systemic inequalities that affects, certain subgroups in all parts of society, understanding how those lead to disease. So even though it's not something that it was definitely taught back in the day, I think it's something still not talked about enough, for sure. So there's definitely a lot more that needs to be done. But I think more and more clinicians as a whole are starting to understand the importance of it. Now, the real world implementation is much harder, because look at the environment we're in right now with like COVID-19. I mean, physicians or clinicians as a whole they're just trying to survive themselves with the inundation of sick people. But even COVID-19 is a perfect example, because it's not just, okay, we can treat people by, putting them on oxygen and prednisone and trying to give them as much benefit as we can therapeutically, but what are the other kind of factors causing people to have disease? It really ends up being political. It ends up being a lot of things outside of the scope of medicine, or at least of the practice of medicine. But it's getting clinicians to start thinking about, well, maybe our scope needs to go beyond just point of care. Maybe we do need to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Course.
Absolutely. Whenever I speak with medical students or veterinary students, I always encourage them to think about not just the patient in front of you, but the story, the exposure that that patient has had. It's not, you can't just, it's all about holistic. There's a story with everybody. And regardless of what species you're treating, you have to be aware of what this living being has been around and surrounded by and exposed to. Absolutely.
100%. And it's part of also at Astra's mission. One of our missions as well is diversity, but we also, one of the reasons that we're showing it and what we're trying to do is to make science cool for everybody, and try to elevate science as a whole, and especially underrepresented communities, because underrepresented communities tend to have different, like from Puerto Rico, youth, me growing up back in the day, like I might have wanted to be like Jose Canseco, which is again around the same time period of Captain Planet, I think. Baseball player, or at that point, like maybe Mark Anthony or Ricky Martin. Now it's like Daddy Yankee or whatnot. So we look, and that's just, I'm just speaking from BIPOC communities, looking up to athletes or musicians, of how we see how we can elevate ourselves and move ourselves up in social status. But realistically, science is more than likely, everyone has a chance to succeed. 100% you can succeed in STEM, regardless of your background. There's room for you in the tent of STEM, whether you want to be a physician, a nurse, an environmental scientist. There's 100% you can do a job in that, and it will be a good job. It will be a good paying job where you're making low six figures, mid six figures, as opposed to those other things that people aspire to do. Realistically, it's a lot easier to make 10,000 physicians than it is to make 10,000 Daddy Yankees or 10,000 LeBron James. It's just the reality. And I think that will obviously help societies elevate, especially underrepresented communities that struggle with socioeconomic disparities. But then as a whole, just elevating science, giving scientists platforms to make sure that science is respected for the time and the energy that it requires to be an expert in your field and be a master at your craft, and know that just because you can Google something, it's not the same thing as spending 3 decades doing it. So
yes, exactly. When I go to the animal hospital and I speak with clients who are the owners of my patients, sometimes they tell me that they look something up online, and I'm like, you know what, Dr. Google could never have passed veterinary school.
yeah.
So just ask me. just ask a veterinarian. Yeah, exactly. And a question about the AI and population health in general. So I want to know, how far can this go? Because it sounds like the vast majority of emerging infectious diseases originate in animals. So does that mean that we could use AI to look at wildlife diseases and diseases in pets that are like sleeping on the pillowcases of your patients and things like that? Like, how far can we go?
I think we need to go as far as we can, because for AI to be able to be, as I mentioned before, to be able to really solve some of these very difficult, complex problems, it needs to have data sets that are integrated so they're not siloed. So we need to bring in the environmental data, the social media data, we have to bring in travel data, we have to bring in weather data, we have to bring in other environmental data, with point of care, to really start understanding how disease happens. One of the things that we haven't done enough is respect the environment in many aspects, whether it's not just a climate change issue, it's just really focusing on basic science. There's so much we don't understand of animals around us, of the world around us. We haven't even, there's new species that are evolving all the time that we're not keeping track of. And even the species that we do know of, we don't understand them fully because we don't fund basic science enough. And it's tough from a governmental perspective, because I understand people are, you have different priorities, and people are always going to poo-poo and say, why are you, wasting your time on studying like the sexual orientations of guinea pigs or something like that. as opposed to all these other things that are understandably people could say are more important, but really understanding the basic sciences of any species, of all species, can help us understand how these things can evolve. I mean, right now, the working theory, or one potential working theory, is yes, that it may have come from a bat or something else originally. And we know that there are many animals that are reservoirs for disease. And we've known this for decades, but we don't actually spend the time in trying to understand what are those diseases. What is going on in these environments? Why do certain animals not have an immunologic response? Like, how do they survive? How do they cohabitate or symbiotically evolve with this? And if go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking there, I know people who are actively trying to pursue this type of research. It's hard to find that funding. And now it's hard. 10 years ago, it was pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
So it's that they're starting to collect the data. I'm just curious, how can we, scientists of all different backgrounds, combine and collect data in the same way so that we can start to compare and contrast data amongst sectors? Like, how can we actually practice a One Health approach and combine everything? Is there going to be a barrier, or is AI so advanced that we can compare and contrast different data collecting systems?
Eventually AI can kind of clean it up for you, but realistically, like I help a lot of companies and governments try to figure out what they're going to do with data, at least over my career I have. And everyone has the same problem, because the way data has been collected when data started being collected, and the way machine learning actually, or AI, or natural language processing, or any other kind of computational algorithm looks at it, is very different, because the data was never structured to have convolutional neural networks evaluate it. And so you need to have standardizations of how you're going to be doing it to be able to kind of plug and play right away. If not, it's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to integrate rapidly, because you're going to have someone come in, take the siloed data, put it into a data lake where now it's kind of all integrated. Then you're going to have to go through, clean up the data, see what's real, what's not real. Then you have to actually go through and segment the data. So break it down into its constituent parts that are going to be understood by a computer, because computers look at zeros and ones, at least traditional computers. So understanding how data translates into mathematics, because at the end of the day, that's all artificial intelligence is. It's just fancy math, really, really fancy math, but it's just math. And then after you segment it, you actually have to annotate it. So at this point, the AI is not so advanced. I mean, it can show you that there are some correlations, but it's not going to understand what that correlation is until you have someone come in and teach it what that correlation is. And then even though there is, we may not even know what the correlation is, but we can start trying to say, all right, that's interesting. Let's try to figure out if there's causation there, or what kind of parameters may be leading to that causation. So unfortunately, until we have standardization across data collection, and realistically, this is why one of the reasons I have a soapbox, that everyone should be taught AI, because AI is so pervasive and will continue to be so pervasive throughout entire society. It touches every industry, that in computer science, coding, artificial intelligence needs to be a natural language that we learn. Just like we learn English, we should be teaching coding as a second language. Because of this very thing, because regardless if you go into business or into you're a veterinarian or you're a physician, it's going to be a part of your life, and you need to know the limitations of those things, and you need to understand the concepts behind data, the concepts behind data bias, to be able to really take those things and implement them in a proper way and be able to create the next generation of solutions.
Totally agree. And it reminds me of, if you go to Harvard and Cambridge and Massachusetts and you go to the library, you see this massive computer. It is massive and it weighs a few tons, right? And now I can lift my computer with one hand. So it sounds to me like it's that type of comparison. Moving forward, we're going to be in a whole nother world because AI is going to be taking us there. But just like when I was in high school, I learned how to type on the keyboard, so I'm not just poking with my two fingers. Yeah. And so kids these days are learning coding in the same type of way.
Well, they should be. I don't know if they're all doing it, but they should be for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation. Do you have any final words for our listeners? And these listeners tend to be One Health advocates, and they might want to go into medicine. They might want to be the second intergalactic doctor if there's not already a second one. But yeah, any words of wisdom?
Yeah, keep at it. Whatever you're doing, keep at it. We're all going to have failure. We're all going to struggle. We're all going to fall. Whatever circle you're in, keep pushing. Failure means that you're working in the right direction. You're just learning from it, and help somebody along the way. I think that's the most important thing you can take along with you, because at the end of the day, it's really about how we're helping each other and how we're pushing the needle forward for all of us.
Fantastic final words. Thank you so much, Jose. This has been such a pleasure. Onwards and upwards. I'll see you all next time.
All right, Deborah, thank you very much.
My pleasure.